So, hey guys, welcome to another episode of Pastors in Recovery. And I'm excited to be here with Pastor Brian. He's a pastor of a church in Arizona. And it's kind of fun because we're sitting here in the community library surrounded by books, and there's people just kind of hanging out. And we're just kind of hanging out and chilling here in the library. And I've asked him to come and be on the podcast because he's got a cool story. He's a church planter. He's done a lot of different things in the ministry and in his walk. So, Brian, it is so cool to have you. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks for inviting me out. I'm glad that we get to do this in the midst of this community library.
Yeah, right.
Welcome to Pastors in Recovery, a podcast dedicated to ministry leaders and pastors navigating the challenges of their own hurts, hang-ups, and habits. Hosted by Jon Hammond, a grateful believer in Jesus Christ and a pastor on the road of recovery. This space is here to remind you that God's grace is bigger than any struggle. Each episode brings real stories of redemption, practical tools for healing, and encouragement rooted in Christ's promise of renewal. You don't have to walk this journey alone. Let's explore how God meets us in our brokenness and brings light to our darkest moments. Welcome to the conversation.
So, my first question for you is really want to talk about your call to ministry. Every journey into ministry is unique. Can you take us back to the moment when you first felt God's call and what was happening in your life at that time? And how did you know this was the path He had for you?
It's a great question. So that call, it predates the actual planting by a number of years. We officially moved out here in 22. We started the church in my living room. It grew into a school, that grew into another school, that grew into a grand opening in 23. But it started way back in 2007. I was a college student at the Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois. And I was in my dorm, and I was processing with a couple of my roommates just how do we reach the people on our campus. I joined a collegiate ministry called Campus Crusade for Christ. It's known as Cru now. And they had, I don't know if it was because I had the ability to talk or I had a pulse, but they basically made me president. And within like 3 months from, just coming into that place for the first time to being president of it, and really tasked with this challenge of how do we, reach the lost within the campus. And so what ended up happening is I would go on the quad, I would have conversations, I would talk with people, and I would bring them to our event that we had every Thursday. And the problem was everyone that I brought, I was the only one talking with them. And so they'd come, they'd actually make their, change their schedule to come to our event. And I'd be the only one to have a conversation. And I would always ask people like, hey, why are you not talking with the people that are coming in for the first time? And it was a number of things. Oh, I'm shy, or I'm quiet, or whatever, or I'm nervous. I'm just like, guys, if we can't engage conversation with those that are making the sacrifice to come into our space, and how in the world are we going to reach this generation, our generation, the millennials? And so that began to spin my wheels, and I started going from church to church just to figure out who's doing it well. And that was even more frustration because what I saw was so many churches, you'd have this group of college students coming in. There was really no integration with us. There was really no sense of like, hey, come into this church, be a part of this. Let's walk with you or grow with you. It was like we were a segmented population. We'd go on Sunday, we'd come back, and that was it. That really was it. And I was just like, man, there's got to be a way to capture this generation. So what started fueling in my heart was just what I didn't know it at the time, but it was a call to plant a church. And I didn't even know that language. I didn't have that language. That language was foreign to me. I was like, 21, and I just saw the need, but was burdening on my heart was how do I reach this generation that's cool with Jesus? They know of Jesus, but they don't see him as Lord and they don't see him as King. And so, I'm sitting in my dorm. A buddy of mine gives me a sermon. It's a 7-minute video. And basically, it's the first time I ever hear the words, the language of church planting. And I remember pausing this YouTube video and I was like, oh my goodness, this is what I feel this call.
Right.
And it was the first time language was applied to it. And from that point on, I tried to do 3 things: get around the best men I could find who I could, learn from. 2, explore planting stuff, creating stuff, trying to start new things and seeing if I could grow them. And then 3 was really trying to dial into a church that would be able to take those next steps with me and pour into me. So by God's grace, all 3 of them happened within that next year. And that kind of is what kickstarted this whole journey.
Well, that is really interesting how not only did you see the need, when you're in the Campus Crusade for Christ, that's what you say, Campus Crusade.
Yeah,
it's called Crew now?
It's called Crew now, yeah.
Crew, interesting. But your college roommate shows you this video. That's really interesting how God uses different things to redirect us. And I was just kind of thinking, I would imagine you must have had challenges, but what were the challenges to kind of get to that place?
Well, I think the first thing was just because you feel a calling or stirring doesn't mean the timing is now. And so I think the first big thing is recognizing God has a plan and a path, and He calls you to follow His plan by walking the path with Him. And that path will cause you to go through hardship and in seasons of longing, seasons of waiting, seasons where it seems like the call's never going to come to fruition. And He places people along the way that are going to help instill within you, I would say, aspects of the areas you need to grow. And so I think one of the more challenging things for young men and young women especially is you kind of like can hear this call and think, okay, this is what I'm going to go do. Not recognizing in order to accomplish that, you need to change. And more than likely, you need to be humbled. Well, the problem with humble is it sounds great, but the only way of gaining it is humiliation. And the only way of gaining that and not kind of allowing that to turn your heart against people is recognizing there was a humble king who came onto this earth, died the death that you and I deserve, and now He invites us into the journey with Him. So yeah, you can get the call, but normally the path that He's going to bring you down to actually be faithful to what He's called you to involves a lot of growth.
Glad you said that, because you think of the different men and women in the Bible. Look at Moses' journey. He didn't lead the people out of Israel. He tried to do it in his own.
Yep.
And that didn't work out. Nope. And finally, God had to send him out in the wilderness for 40 years until God finally brought him back as a old man.
Yeah, deeply humbled.
Yeah, is very humbled.
Yeah.
And even like Paul the Apostle, he had a Damascus experience, and God had to, Jesus had to appear to him on the road. And so I love that you mentioned that, because that leads me to the big next question for you. Just knowing a little about your story is, at some point in your journey, you encountered struggles with hurts, hang-ups, and habits that led you to a recovery program. Can you share a bit about that season, and what did it take for you to recognize the need for healing, and how did God work through that process?
Yeah, there's kind of 3 big buckets there. The first one was just growing up from, I think, boyhood into manhood. So from 21 to my late 20s, your 20s is a decade where you're pushing the boundaries of what has God called me? What has He gifted me in? It's usually the decade you're getting married, although that is increasingly changing to the 3rd decade of your life as people push back marriage. But I met my now wife at 24. We started dating, got married at 25, had a really rocky relationship. And so one of the first things that had to happen was the Lord had to show me how to lovingly come alongside this woman and both lead her faithfully, but also be for her. And I just had a lot of insecurities. I was a young guy who really felt like I needed to prove something to someone. And she's a person who just by nature is very responsible, very diligent. We both graduated high school the same year. She was done with her master's. I was still working on my bachelor's. Like that kind of tells you the kind of personality she is. I looked at homework assignments as optional. And that was only if I had, done friendship time. It was like we just were totally different people. So God rocked my world with her by really challenging me, like, are her wins going to become my wins, and are my wins going to be celebrated within her? And what He did in his grace, but also in His hardship was, we had struggles with fertility. And so one of the things that we really had to walk through early on in the marriage was just fertility issues and then loss. We had a miscarriage, and then we had an actual, our firstborn was born at 20 weeks, 6 days. And, I got to hold him as he died in my arms. And at 28 years old, it introduces two things. One, your lack of control. You do not have control over the things you thought you could or did. And the second thing is the brevity of life, that there are things that are important, and then there's things that are deeply important. Now, in that season, when you find yourself in a season like that, the first instinct you're going to have is just to run away. You just want to get out of it. But what God did is he brought Melinda and I closer. He allowed that pain to be something that forged within me a deep growing up, and then also hey, you've got to lead your wife now, who's really, really, really fragile and hurting. And so that was bucket one, was how do you take a man who is deeply insecure into a position now where he's going to lead? And part of that process was pain. The second bucket was dealing with father wounds. And you're dealing with, for me, it was primarily my pastor and my father. And both of them are good men, but both of them are men who were hurt in similar ways. And the ways that they coached and developed and trained me kind of co-aligned in a way that played early on as I was a young man. It played into my weaknesses. And then as I became a man in my 30s, it began to become points of tension. And so what God really had to do in that season was he had to show me that he was enough even when the bottom fell out. So my pastor and I, 2016, have a conflict. It erupts. I wound him. And I now know what that feels like as a lead pastor, to be wounded by someone that you're pouring into. But rather than push in and see that God can even teach you in that, he shut down. And so from that point on, 2016 on, our relationship was basically sundered. It was there on the external, but it was not there in the internal. And that started a 4-year process where his trust in me eroded until finally, fall of 19, I'm going through a medical crisis. I get dragged before the elders, and basically it's a firing squad. They've got all the ammunition because he's convinced I'm trying to take the church from him. That 3-hour meeting was wild, because what began with all 7 of those elders convinced I was, this type of guy, by the end of it, I could see several of them had softened. Well, they continued deliberating for 4 more hours. The next day, I get a call from my lead pastor. He says, come over. So I do. It's one of the most awkward breakfasts I've ever had in my life. He's like, I can't fire you because the elders don't see it, but so that means we've got to work through it.
Mm.
So an hour and a half into that conversation, he breaks down and just starts bawling. And he's just like, the thing I've been convinced you were doing to me, I've been doing to you.
Wow.
Yeah. And it changed. Now, here's the thing, and this is where forgiveness and reconciliation, like a proper theology work, where it allowed us to move forward, but I was never going to trust him in the same way. And we knew we were going to have to move on to different spheres.
Right.
But there could still be a sense of love and still be a sense of friendship, to move us forward. And so that happened. And then really, that kind of paved the way for how do you move faithfully when you feel betrayed? Because the truth of it is, if you're going to be a minister of gospel, betrayal will happen. The people you love, the things you hold to the closest will fail. And you can't become rogue or Saul-like in your approach. You can't just be chucking spears at people. And so that then led to the third bucket. And the third bucket for me was dealing with the self. It was actually dealing with my sin. And so, I battled pornography for 20 years. And battle is probably putting it nicely. It mastered me for 2 decades. And then in 2019, I went through a physical crisis, and that was the first kind of chipping away. And I started into a program at that time that was basically like an AA program for sexual addicts. And we started to meet weekly, and we started to have, get a sponsor and just accountable. Like, how do we stay accountable to one another? And what was crazy is I never found full freedom in that program. But what that program did is it gave me tools of how to be open, how to confess it, how to recognize that the sin of lust is really that surface sin. What's driving it are often things well beneath the surface of feeling inadequate or escapism or stress relief that's driven by and feeling deep insecurity. And so those tools began to get in hand. And then in 2020, the Lord in his grace was basically like, I'm going to take this from you. And it's like, well, man, why can't I have that moment? Well, the way he did it was he did it in pain. And basically I woke up one day and I was feeling some issues in my stomach and my gallbladder area. And I was like, okay, I'll go take a look at it. And they're doing this, this kind of Doppler on it. And all of a sudden the nurse goes quiet and she's like, goes outside the room, comes back. They're like, hey, there's something like on your liver. We got to get this checked out. So then we go get this liver biopsy done. And they're like, it's inconclusive. We got to get you to an MRI. And that whole time, I just feel like the Lord was just very, very clearly being like, hey, regardless of what happens, your trust has to be in me. But if your trust is going to be in me, then I need your obedience to be in me as well. And the Lord in that season just broke me. Like whatever vestiges of that sin that it had over me, like was done. And I remember telling my wife, I was like, I think God is freeing me fully from this. And that was November of 2020. And from that point forward, it's never been the same. He freed me. And it was one of those radical things where like he took the desire, the craving away, and he gave in its place just a depth of thankfulness and gratitude that comes from walking in obedience to your Father. Come back, all the scans are fine, all those things. But what he did in that season was fundamentally break me of something that I couldn't, in my own strength, have been broken by. And that really kind of set us up. Like those three big pillars kind of set us up to 2021 now. We're raising support, we're building our team, and we're looking to move out here in 22. And the truth of it is there's more pillars. There's more things. There's like, sometimes it's the same lesson, just relearned. Sometimes it's a different lesson. Like right now I'm going through leadership challenges where I'm looking at, how do I help steward men and women who helped us grow from 20 to 50 to 150. But around 250, they started becoming issues. Like they're, and now at 500, it's like, whoa, this is not working. Right. And those are extraordinarily hard conversations because they're often very faithful people, very diligent people whose skill set and mindset and ability is great for interpersonal, but not really gifted for leading teams of teams and for being leaders of leaders, which you think, oh, it's okay, we'll deal with it, until you recognize every leadership decision you make or don't make has upstream and downstream consequences. So you may be helping that person not feel like a failure, but who's being hurt by the lack of leadership you're allowing on your team.
Yes.
So, man, the lessons never stop. But,
no.
Yeah.
Wow. So you talk about those pillars, and I know if some of you pastors are listening to this right now are thinking, okay, I raised my hand when he said one of those, or maybe two, maybe all three of those you've experienced.
Yeah.
That's really the heart of this podcast is this podcast is for you. Those of you that are listening to this right now, it's about you. It's about how can you find the help and the freedom in these difficult times? Because not only are you struggling with your own hurts, your hang-ups and habits, but also as a leader of leaders, you're dealing with all kinds of dynamics that you've never been prepared for. And it's interesting, Brian, because you're talking about how, your church has grown. And so like suddenly the things that you need as a leader yourself change as the church goes through those different cycles of growth.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, the church is 50. I can do that. Now it's 100. Okay, let's bring on a team. Now it's 250. Oh, goodness. Okay, how are we going to do this? And now you're getting to that level where you have to entrust leaders to lead leaders. And then with the leaders of volunteers that are leading people.
Yeah.
And you get more and more removed, but you're still you.
Yeah.
No matter what level your church is at, you're still got to wake up in the morning and you got to look in the mirror and say, hey, I'm Brian, or hey, I'm John. And what is God doing in my life right now? And how am I going to be able to pastor this? And will my own hurts, hang-ups, and habits cause me to fail to be the person that I need, that God, that you've called me to be in this moment?
Yeah.
So because I really want to talk about the church planting thing. It's interesting that when you talk about how God had really worked in your life and set you free from these struggles by giving you, pretty much inflicting you with pain.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But me having been a church planter and failed more than once, you still feel this call of God to plant a church here in Arizona. And as we all know, those of you that are church planters listening to this, there's moments of great joy. There's moments where you wonder if you can even keep going. Why did I even choose to do this? Is this the stupidest thing I've ever done? What am I doing? My poor wife and my kids are being dragged into this craziness. So you may have already answered this question, but what is probably the biggest challenge that God is stretching you right now? What is the biggest challenge that's taking the most level of courage for you right where you are, like today?
Yeah. Number one is to be willing to have hard conversations with the people you love the most. And so this is multifaceted. It's in your family and being able to hear it from people within your family. So it goes both ways. My kids are all young, 9, 7, 5, and 3. So my role at those ages really is still much of a guiding, shepherding, parenting. Dad is a larger than life figure.
Right.
And that will change as we get to those teen years and especially into those young adult years. But it's constant conversation between my wife and I. But the hardest conversations I find for me right now are not within the family. It's within the staff team and it's within the leadership of the church.
Right. You talked about that, right?
And so what's happening is you have to be able to navigate men and women whose skill sets will grow with your church. Some of whose skill sets will see, like they'll hit the ceiling at your church. And how do you move them to something that the Lord has called them to when what previously worked is no longer working? Sometimes you're going to have volunteers who show up and they are blowing it away. And now you've got a scenario where it's like that person's giftings fit the needs of this, and yet they're a volunteer. I can't be putting a ton of burden on them. And so now I'm thinking through, who do we hire? How do we go about that process? Are they not just a competency fit, but also a cultural fit and a character fit? And then you're thinking through, and those who have helped us get from 50 to 100, to 150 to 250 to 500, how do you care for them? Because you want to make sure that you're not just using them to grow your church, but then you also realize by keeping people in leadership positions that they're not doing well, you're hurting those underneath them. And they're looking at you saying, why do you prefer that person over the care of your whole congregation? So hard conversations. Number one is, are you willing to push in? And then number two, once you know, are you willing to act on it quickly? I think a lot of times we as pastors, we can double guess ourselves. We can kind of think through and sometimes over spiritualize. It's like, the Lord works with the broken. He does, and he draws straight lines with crooked sticks, and he does. And we can kind of think so, but the problem with that isn't so much that it's not that he can't do those things, is that we start to define the playbook for him. Here's how you should work within my church. And we as pastors have to be humble enough to say, I don't know how you're going to work, but I trust that you're going to lead me by bringing the right conversations in the times I need them, by prompting through your word and through your spirit a direction within my heart of what needs to happen, and then by giving confirmation. So like, for instance, this last couple of weeks, probably month, I've had conversation after conversation after conversation with men and women who are seeing needs at the top levels of our church and wondering what I'm going to do to help bring leadership to those areas, and what I'm going to do to get the leadership that's in some of our leading capacities either out or into areas of better fit.
Okay.
And so when I start to have, when those start to stack, it's like, okay, God, what you're doing something through the congregation that's already matching what I feel like from your spirit and in your word is I need to lead in this and I need to take ownership over it. Where it gets hard is when those people are your friends.
Right. So that's really stretching you
Right.
because you care about those
Well,
people.
you care deeply.
And you're like, okay, do I redirect them to another place where maybe they're better fit now?
Yeah.
The church is growing. But if I have to let them go, I mean, it's like telling your friend, you're not good enough anymore or something.
Right. And that's what
and
it
you know what
feels
it
like.
feels like to be in
Yes.
front of a board
Yes.
and being drilled like
Yeah.
you're this person, you're this person.
Well,
You don't want them to feel like that.
You don't want them to feel like that. And what you have to do, so two things. One, you want clarity, which means you want wisdom around you. But then the second thing, you have to trust that God's going to tell a better story for their life than what I would imagine or fear. And so I think sometimes fear can keep you with a person too long. Fear can also keep you with the person not long enough. And so you have to be able to okay, I'm going to gather some wisdom board. I'm going to gather my elders if you've got them. I'm going to gather other, men who I can put this out there and say, hey, would you pray with me on this and seek the Lord with me on this?
That's what I was going to ask you, Ness, is how are you handling this?
Yeah.
Because there's got to be, as a church planner, you must have mentors and people in your life that you can go to and talk about this stuff because you've never been here before.
No.
So how do you know what to do next if you don't have the experience?
I would say two things. One, a strong provisional board is essential if you're planting. And then two, you should be cultivating as a lead pastor. Who are those men that God's given you? Sometimes they're going to be business leaders. Sometimes they're going to be people of immense spiritual strength. Sometimes they're going to be natural shepherders. But how are you cultivating those guys within your church to say, hey, you know what? You're not an elder, but I need your wisdom on this. And I'm kind of building like a advisory team that I think some of them are going to go on to be elders at my church. Some of them never will be. They're not going to meet the qualifications, but they are solid on business principles, or they're solid on an understanding of how they're seeing things within the ministry that I can still rely on.
Because they have experience working with people.
Yes.
And knowing those dynamics.
Yes. Business leaders, they've got teams, they know how to work through teams. They've hired, they've fired. So for us, like we will install elders, once we get out of the first 3 years, that's when we start to cultivate those elders and then we move to install them. But within the first 3 years of a plant, depending on how you do it, a lot of times you don't know who's going to be with you, 3 years in. You can start with a family and raise them up. And they could be gung-ho, we're all in, and all of a sudden 6 months later, you're like, where'd they go?
Right.
It's sadly very, very common. Those who start with you don't always finish with you.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of want to give some time and space, like, hey, who's staying faithful throughout these months and throughout the years? But in that phase, you still need accountability, and you also still need wisdom. So getting other voices around you that can help you, pray with you, encourage you, and affirm. Here's the decision, and we're behind it. That's super helpful.
That's amazing. Well, you're definitely, Brian, you're at a crossroads of decision making right now because obviously you want God to do what he's called you to do, and the church is growing. And I know you guys meet like in a rented facility, and it would be nice to perhaps find a permanent home.
Yes.
And, it's not like land is getting any cheaper around here because this is a fast growing area. But yet there's just hundreds and thousands of new families moving into this area. And so I know the harvest is ripe here. You've got people coming to this area that are already churched and looking for a new church home. And you have people that haven't even met Jesus. I like what my friend said one time. He says, there's people that are moving here. They don't even know they need Jesus yet. and God's bringing them here.
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, you got to be thinking about what's going on now. You got to be thinking about the future. What's it going to look like in 3 years and 5 years and 10 years? And so you got to make decisions about that. And you got to think about what is the best way to steward those finances. Do we buy land? Do we wait? And then you've got your own personal dynamics. How are you handling your own pain right now? because before we started this podcast, you tell me, you just came from physical therapy. So you're dealing with your own physical stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And these are distractions. Pain can be very distracting. You got to work with your family and the dynamics. You got your young kids that you're being a dad to, and your wife who has needs. And, you guys got to go to Costco and get groceries. And there's all this stuff going on. And I could just, having been in a church planner before, it's like, how many hats can I wear and which hat is the most important? And so you kind of look at priorities in your life. My relationship with Jesus is first. My family is definitely second because God has called me to be a husband and a father. But then there's this call to raise up this church. And how much time is this taking out of my day and my life? And I don't want that to interfere with my relationship with my wife. I don't want it to interfere with my kids. But at the same time, I have all these people that are volunteering and they're giving up tons of hours as well. So I want to be the best example. I want to be able to lead these people. I want to know who should be on board on this boat. How fast should the boat go? How fast should it turn right or left? And so I'm kind of setting this up for the final question in our podcast as we kind of wrapping this up, is there's probably someone out here listening and going, okay, I'm a church planner. I'm not where you are right now, but I know I'm going to be. Or there could be other pastors that are listening right now and saying, yeah, I've been down that road before, but I'm in a new place and a new challenge. I'm past the 500. I'm at a 2000. I got these new dynamics that I'm dealing with. But pastor, you listening right now, it doesn't matter where you're at in any of these levels of church growth when it comes down to how are you doing in the midst of all of this? How are you doing in this? What are you doing to take care of yourself? What are you doing? I mean, do you have somebody in your life you can talk to about the deeper stuff in your life? Have you been struggling looking at things you should have been looking at? Have you been secretly doing things to medicate the pain through maybe alcohol or, whatever? And I mean, maybe it's just shopping or, spending money, buying that a truck, or, you're in a tech and you're going to buy a bunch of, new sound system, whatever it is. What are you doing to take care of you? And what are you doing to take care of that relationship with your wife that you have committed your life to? Because that's where it all started. Your family started with her, right? And so, Brian, I just want to ask you to just kind of speak directly to these people that might be listening, is what advice would you give to pastors who are struggling to keep going and not give up? Because, there could be somebody right now who's like, you know what, I'm ready to throw in the towel.
Yeah.
I'm done with this. It's too hard on my family. This is too hard on my, maybe I just want to go back into construction or something or whatever. Is that call of God real? Should I really be following this call?
It's a great question. It's one of those where I think my answer is one of probably many that are helpful or faithful or could be taken. I think for me, it's like I've never gotten to that point where I'm like questioning, really questioning, I need to get out. But I have gotten many times to that point where I'm like, what in the world do I do? Like, I feel the drive, I feel the burn, I feel ready, but I don't know what to do. So it's not aimless. It's just overwhelming. But if you're a guy who's just like, I don't know, I think I'm ready to throw in the towel. I think what I would do is, before you make any big decisions like that, hire, fire, or anything like that, you bring it before the Lord, and you also bring it before a board or a group of men that you've called up to your wisdom board. You process it with your wife if you got a wife. Like, you don't just fly off and make a quick rash decision like that. You want to spend time and make sure, like, is the Lord leading me out? And if so, is he leading me to raise somebody up in this place? Like, is there something good here that's worth passing on? Or is he calling me to dig deep and to move forward in it, trusting him? I think you talked about this. What are the disciplines that help you navigate what are the the increasing difficulties of leading a church within today's day and age. I'd say number one, do you have a robust and healthy relationship with Jesus? Like, is he actually your king and your friend? Because you will lose your way if you're not spending time and still being undone by him and his word. It is the only thing that's going to keep you faithful. The second thing, you've got to have a very strong and healthy marriage. That doesn't mean you can't go through difficulties. If you're experiencing kind of week after week, don't be above marriage counseling. Don't be above pushing into couples counseling or individual. Melinda and I did that. The first 6 months we were out here, we had a counselor, and it was really helpful because it was a big, big, big change for both of us. Yeah. The third thing, you've got to have rhythms of rest and working out. And I think a lot of guys, especially high strung, you're going to have trouble sleeping. And part of that's because your mind's racing, your brain's constantly on. It's going from conversation to conversation. You're thinking about all the things in a way that nobody else is for your church. And so part of what you've got to do is, how do you shut the brain down? How do you turn the cell phone off? How do you gear yourself up to go to bed? Are there supplements you need to take? Like if you're chronically sleep deprived? And working out, are you taking care of yourself physically? This job will age you like nobody's business. And it will also do it very thanklessly. Like you will pour hour upon hour upon hour, and no one will know and no one will care. And so you have to be the one that takes that into your hands to take care of yourself, to work out, to eat healthy, and to get yourself adequate sleep. So why do you do any of those things? So that your brain isn't constantly foggy. I mean, putting a sermon is hard enough. When you're half asleep and your brain's just all sorts of unwired, that becomes an act of faith in and of itself. And that's all good. I'm all for faith, as far as informing how we're delivering the sermon, but getting ourselves to be kind of in a state of being, state of mind, where we are physically ready, mentally ready, spiritually ready, is always ideal, because you're going to tap in. There's going to be moments where you get into the red. And so you want constantly to have that reserve tank, not because you're going to stay there, but because you need to have bounce back ability. So if you find yourself like right now kind of nodding along and you're like, I've been increasingly growing frustrated or quick tempered, or I'm not bouncing back the way I used to, I would say you got to probably adjust one, if not all three of those areas, and know that if you don't do it, if you don't take ownership of the calendar, no one else will. And you'll spend a decade or more, and at the end of it be like, what did I do that for? And you probably got less done because you were so tired and half wiped for most of those hours.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's some good answers. Thanks for joining me today. And, just really open yourself up, Brian, and sharing this really kind of the wisdom and just kind of maybe the nitty gritty of your journey.
Yeah.
Which hopefully, and I'm pretty confident someone out there is going to relate to. But thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I appreciate it. Hope this is helpful. And if I can encourage any pastor out there, let me know. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. Let's close in prayer. God, I thank you for Pastor Brian's heart to open up and just really be willing to say these things, that his own journey has a story. His story are like nuggets that will be there for someone hearing this, and I'm really praying, God, right now that the listener would feel the Holy Spirit touch their heart as they've been listening to the story today, and that they'll chew on it and even share it with someone else and say, I heard this podcast today, and I'm just asking that you would listen to it. Because Lord, I know that what Brian is facing in this growth is no small endeavor. And so I just lift him up and pray for your encouragement for him and for this church plant. And God, you got great things up ahead. And we're just believing you for those things to take place, and give him the wisdom, the strength, and the courage to walk in those things. And I pray all this in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, John.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Pastors in Recovery. If this podcast resonated with you, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with your fellow pastors. Your support helps spread the message of healing and restoration. Don't miss out on upcoming interviews with pastors and meaningful discussions on real-life struggles and victories in ministry. If you've missed any past episodes, we encourage you to go back and listen. You can support this podcast financially by unlocking exclusive content and being part of this mission by becoming a supporter for just $2 a month. Sign up here at tinyurl.com/support pastors. Again, tinyurl.com/support pastors. Remember, brokenness is where God wants to meet us the most, and that's where the journey of healing begins. Keep pressing forward and know that you're not alone. See you in the next episode.
I've walked this road through joy and sorrow, felt your mercy all my days. From the dawn until the evening, your love has never walked away. Every day you stand beside me. Every night your love shines through. With all I am, my soul will praise you. I will lift my song to you. Through the trials you have led me, through the storm and through the rain. In the darkness you were near me, lifting me through all the pain. Every day you stand beside me. Every night your love shines through. With all I am, my soul will praise you. I will lift my song to you. Your love is all around me, always here to stay. You are right beside me, never walk away. I give my whole heart, lay my life before you. Your love is all around me, always here to stay. Every day you stand beside me. Every night your love shines through. With all I am, my soul will praise you. I will lift my song to you. Every day you stand beside me. Every night your love shines through. With all I am, my soul will praise you. I will lift my song